Y'all, I'm sorry. That took a while. I'll explain in the Q&A coming up where the podcast has been. This episode is meant to catch you up on all of that and answer some of the questions that you sent in and basically get the campfire going again for Tourette's Podcast. But welcome. Season 8 of Tourette's Podcast is real. This is us starting it off together. If you're new to the podcast, and we do have a lot of new listeners who've come to us in the interim. So if you're new to this, my name is Ben. I launched Tourette's Podcast at the beginning of 2018 as a way of getting to know the disorder that I've lived with my whole life without any community because I kept it a secret. I was too ashamed to be branded as the guy with Tourette Syndrome, thought I would never get a girlfriend and all that stuff. So I kept it hidden as best I could. We know that tics are involuntary, and depending on the circumstances, we might be able to suppress and mask our tics to an extent so we don't get questioned about it or looked at or gawked at. That is, if you were me, or took the same course of action to hide from public shame. But around 2017, I was like, who cares? Anyone who has an issue with my tics can take a walk. And plus, I wanted to learn more about and connect with the actual community. I was not plugged into the Tourette community whatsoever. So I contacted the Tourette Association of America, told them about my podcast idea, using that as a tool to have conversations about Tourette syndrome and kind of do some self-discovery. And I wanted to make sure I wasn't duplicating any efforts or harming any efforts that the Tourette Association or anybody else was already doing. So got rolling with the podcast, which took off pretty quickly and gained an audience that I never imagined. And from there, it just became a huge part of my life. Tourette Syndrome and the podcast and its community, which, by the way, includes the Tourette's Podcast discussion group on Facebook, run by the amazing Sophia in the UK. Sophia is one of the coolest people I've ever known, and I sing her praises pretty much every episode. Sophia, thank you for running an amazing discussion group for us, where I've gathered some questions in chat, and I've also received a number of questions from you via email, tourettespodcast@gmail.com, or on various social media presences, including my personal, @BenBrownMultimedia. And that's what we're doing this episode, catching up with you and your questions on Season 8 of Tourette's Podcast. Be right back. The Tourette Association of America is the premier nonprofit working to raise awareness, advance research, and provide ongoing support for those with Tourette syndrome or a tic disorder. With a network of over 130 chapters, support groups, and centers of excellence, the TAA engages with communities across the nation in an effort to provide tools, webinars, workshops, and support for all seeking assistance. As a primary sponsor of Tourette's Podcast, the TAA supports authentic conversations showcasing the diverse representation of the Tourette community. To learn more, go to tourette.org. That's TOURETTE.org. The Tourette Association of America. Uncontrollable, unstoppable. All right, Season 8, and your questions. And oh, by the way, we're still with the Geeks Rising Network. GeeksRising.com. That's the podcast network that carries this podcast to a greater listening audience. Thanks so much to Bandrew and Heather and Zach and Malcolm and Logan and Ducky for their support of Tourette's Podcast and the greater cause of awareness and helping individual Touretters live more fulfilling lives. So the first question here is the most popular individual question asked. Where has the podcast been? All right, so one factor, I talked about it in Season 7, my depression, which was showing resistance to treatment, and I had to get that under control. And I'm sure there will be, occasion to talk about that in specifics over the course of the season. It's something I've dealt with for a very long time, but this previous time just felt like the main event. Like my depression comes and goes in these like swells. And this last one was just bad, to the point of me getting physically sick. My doctors and I went through a lot of different trials, and we found a combination of things that started to get the needle moving toward feeling fine. And if there's any reason for me to go into this right here, other than answering the question in part, is just to acknowledge how awful major depressive disorder is. A lot of people with Tourette also have it. And if you have it and you're battling it, keep going because you're battling for the right reasons. And that's to find something that works for you so you can do what you want to do, so you can feel good again. When you haven't found it, that remedy, it feels like you'll never find it. And when you find it, the fight was totally worth it. Again, you can have a good time again. What I've got is not a permanent solution. The meds that I'm on, I tend to plateau on things. And if I do that with my current meds, I'll get back on the search for something new. But I want to say thanks to everybody for checking in. I heard from a lot of you, and that definitely played a positive role as well. So I want to thank you and actually thank certain individuals directly. Well, you know who you are, for being there because you knew this was a tough thing to go alone, as Tourette can surely be, as depression can surely be, as anxiety is. And that's part of the why of this community. So the biggest thank you ever for your patience and correspondence as we worked on getting season 8 off the ground. Season 8 is actually really exciting to me because we have some amazing guests in a new way. I'll say that. A new dynamic for Tourette's podcast this season. And you'll be able to hear that in episode 1, which dropped concurrently with this episode 0 of season 8. As for the rest of the question, depression isn't the only thing that was going on. I had a lot of work to do that I was somehow able to pull off, and just things you can file under the category of life. So that's your answer as we restore the podcast again with the amazing help of primary sponsor, the Tourette Association of America, online at tourette.org. Uncontrollable, unstoppable. That's their updated tagline. And they're here for the podcast, in addition to what they offer the community for free. Webinars, scientific research, stories from the community, advocacy at the legislative level. They can help you find a provider. They put on events. There's a lot that happens at TAA. And I'm so glad they're here for Tourette's podcast, which brings us to question number 2. Hey, Ben, why do you call it Tourette's podcast with an S? Aren't we supposed to say Tourette instead of Tourette's? It may be a small detail, but the words we choose are important. So I've gotten this question sometimes in the form of a comment a few times over the years. And what I've said each time is, yes, language is important. The words we use, very important. But, number 1, I don't think we need to quibble too much over this one. Sometimes I say Tourette, sometimes I say Tourette's. We're clearly talking about the same thing. I don't think we need to worry too much about that over this point. It's a French guy's name, Tourette. It could have been anybody else that we credit with the discovery of this disorder, or it could be tic spectrum disorder, as has been floated in the past. If you'll remember a sort of proposal to rename it, and you folks said, no, we don't care. The name Tourette is our name, and that's our community, and we want it to stay. And so whether we say Tourette or Tourette's is not immediately important to me. Let me know if you disagree, if there's something I'm just completely not seeing. But I'll say also, the show title is Singular Tourette, like singular possessive with the apostrophe, Tourette's podcast. Possessive, not a plural, possessive. So it's a podcast of the Tourette community, Tourette Syndrome, Tourette's podcast. So it's the singular Tourette in this case. And if you like, the alternate name for this podcast is the Tourette podcast. And I like that too. But I don't necessarily see it as a hurdle for us to get over before we fight other battles. And we have them. Bringing us right to our next popular question. What do you think is the biggest battle for Tourette syndrome right now? And I would say maybe eye of the beholder on this one. Some maybe think it's Tourette versus Tourette's, but all of this TikTok Tourette stuff and the quote unquote fake Tourette's stuff has really riled the community. For instance, let's just say I'm a teenager, I start ticking. My parents know about my tics, but they've also heard of this so-called mass phenomenon of people ticking or faking their Tourette's after seeing popular TikTok personalities ticking in some kind of cute way. And so I mimic them or mock these tics for some sense of identity or personal storyline. And they think I'm just going through some little growth phase. Like it's just some social media thing, trend that I'm hopping on. Like, I don't think that's a cool judgment to jump to. If I have a disorder affecting my quality of life and help exists, I should have a shot at that help, right? Again, whether it's Tourette syndrome or anything else. So some parents or guardians might think, well, going to the doctor for something that might just be some social media phenomenon is a giant waste of money, right? Shouldn't we just wait and see where this goes? And yeah, I feel that in the context of expensive healthcare, but that's why I'm saying I kind of can't wait for the media to get tired of this one. This thing of whether people are faking Tourette's or whether people are getting Tourette's from TikTok. I just think it's had negative ripple effects on the Tourette community and the conversation, particularly for young women. Let's hope something really good comes out of this. I know the science community has responded to the media pretty aggressively when the media has gotten something wrong about this. Shout out to Dr. Christine Conelia, amazing Tourette doctor who's been helping to set the record straight. You can follow her on Twitter at @CConelea. That's at CCONELEA. Lots of Tourette science and wisdom. All that said, there have been some great pieces in the media doing a better job at reporting on this and busting myths. But that's what I think is an ongoing big battle, I guess. You could also say funding for research, so science gets to know tic disorders better and deliver treatments as the community would like it. Also, I want the Tourette community to know that there is a lot of active science on Tourette. This is not some big mystery. And we do have Tourette scientists and doctors who do an amazing job with their patients and explaining how all this works to the public. We've done episodes on this. So some of my heroes in the science community, providers and researchers who are in it to make quality of life better for people with Tourette. The Tourette Association might have its own opinion on what the biggest challenges are at the moment. I don't speak for them. But also, I'll say don't accuse anybody of faking their tics. Don't get too preoccupied or preoccupied at all with who online you think is real or fake or who's, doing tics for attention or don't worry about that. Because I have heard from some of you about that too. Like, for example, kind of just to generalize, hey, Ben, check out this profile. I think this person is faking Tourette's. What do you think? And I don't want to get involved in that. I mean, if you're a new listener and you found this podcast in context with research about the quote unquote fake Tourette stuff, just please never assume anybody's faking it. I mean, if you have Tourette syndrome, you know how it feels if someone doubts you, thinks you're embellishing or putting it on. And especially if you're expressing that it's real and you want help with it. This can be a really hard disorder to live with. I went into the Tourette's closet when I was a kid because I didn't want anybody to know that I had legit Tourette syndrome. Add to that challenge, being taken seriously at all. That's too much, and I think that's an immediate challenge for us. This has been going on for some time now, yeah, but we certainly got into it in season 7, the whole TikTok Tourette's thing. Listen to the episode we did with Dr. Conalia. I believe that was season 7, episode 14. And let's just be there for each other. All right, so I've pulled out an appropriate listener question for our next one. That is, how can I be the best supporter I can be to the Tourette syndrome community today? And to answer that, I'll pass the ball to my friend Cass, who you're also going to hear more from this season. She posted something on Twitter this past week on what a Tourette ally looks like. I'll just read what she posted. Who is a Tourette's ally? It's someone who, 1, acknowledges and respects our views and experiences. 2, is willing to learn about Tourette's. 3, uses their platform to promote our accessibility, inclusion, and rights. Number 4 of who's a Tourette's ally. It's someone who listens to us to better understand and eliminate any challenges or barriers we may face. And number 5, a Tourette's ally is someone who works in partnership with us without using us to further their agenda. So I thought that was a good roundup of just basic things pretty much anybody can do to support the Tourette community. Cass is another great person to follow online on the Tourette social media stuff. Her handle is @TicsandTats, @TICSNTATTS. @TicsandTats, and thanks, Cass, for that. So here's a question I've gotten a couple times in the interim. What pharmaceuticals have you tried that seem to work best for tics? And this is one I'm not going to answer because I haven't taken medication for tics in a very long time. And even if I had, I'd be hesitant to recommend any particular medication because it might not be the ticket for you. And yes, information sharing is really important, but I'm not a doctor or anything of the sort. And that's where I think the conversation needs to be had with a doctor. So I'm sorry. I do take meds for depression and anxiety, but same deal. I don't think it's appropriate for me to talk about medicine on the podcast unless we have a doctor here with us who can be at the steering wheel. But that could be in the cards for sure. We could do an episode like that. Here's a question that came in just one time from a listener named Maria, but I like it, so I'm going to answer it. Who is your favorite photographer and whose work do you relate to most? Thank you for that, Maria. It's hard to pin down any single photographer, but I think the best of the best was and still probably is Gordon Parks. I like Lars Thunbjörk a lot because there's often some interesting weirdness in his photos. Helen Levitt, Tony Ray Jones, I can go on and on. There's some good escapism for me in looking at photo books instead of looking at, small photos on Instagram, like, picking up a big photo book and really absorbing the photo in a larger format. That's kind of an escapist thing I do. William Eggleston, I love. This is not a Tourette question, but a shout out to photographer Lowell Handler, who is definitely an influence on me. We talked with him before, but I think doing an episode directly with him one-on-one could be a lot of fun and really interesting. He was the photographer for the late Oliver Sacks, and I know he has stories. So here's a question that's come in many times, including in the recent interim, but I think it's worth going over again. And the question is there an advantage to not telling my child about his or her Tourette diagnosis? We've talked about this one before, and I get where the question comes from. I know it's a place of love, but unless there are circumstances going on that I'm not thinking about, I think it's a bad idea to withhold it, just me personally. to withhold that information. I know you don't want to saddle them with all the chaotic thoughts that must accompany something like this. Like, just want to let you know you have Tourette syndrome. All the questions that come up, it could be overwhelming, but noticing something really different about yourself as a kid or even a teen or an adult and having questions about yourself and what's wrong with me. I think that's big. And I think it's important to have answers that maybe you can get used to from your childhood. But I get it. If you don't recognize something stigmatized in yourself, then maybe you'll just be blissfully happier. I was about to say ignorant. That's the wrong way to say it, because I think we become very self-aware when we have something like Tourette syndrome. It's a huge hypothetical. And with the number of people who already feel isolated with Tourette, I think it's important to be honest, answer the questions that the diagnosed individual is going to have about, why can't I stop making these noises or doing these movements? I mean, it's going to come up. And I think a better thing to look back on is the fact that support and love were there from the start with the Tourette diagnosis. And when I say diagnosis, that implies access to a provider. And some of you tell me you can't even get that. You can't even get a diagnosis because the nearest knowledgeable doctor is so far away. Or maybe you've seen a doctor who dismissed your symptoms as just something that happens and it'll go away. That happens too. I get emails from you about that. So you as a parent make the call about what you think is best for your child, but you don't want an adult who never got the care they might have wanted or needed as a kid. And sometimes that'll come with being honest about the diagnosis hanging over them. And that question was specific to Tourette, so I'm keeping that answer specific to Tourette. I can't speak for any other diagnosis. And I can barely speak to this because I'm not a parent. I'm someone who grew up with and still lives with Tourette syndrome, so maybe it's easier for me to say than do as a biased individual. I'm not a doctor or a therapist or anything like that. I'm a photographer with Tourette's. So, question here. Another question we've heard before. Has there ever been a funny Tourette's joke? And I'm going to say ear of the beholder on this one. I've talked with Touretters who were totally okay with it, with Tourette's jokes. My personal thoughts, if you're a comedian who doesn't have Tourette syndrome, and you make a Tourette joke, my stomach is usually turning. Not necessarily because I'm directly offended or anything like that, but because I think it's the most worn out, amateur night, unfunny, unoriginal category of material you can pick from, making fun of Tourette syndrome. And if you don't have Tourette syndrome, because that's pretty whack stand-up material. And yeah, I'm biased because I know about Tourette, and investigation is the death of all humor. But again, this is a disorder that frequently sets on in one's youth or adolescence. And we're talking quality of life with real sensitivity, with something profoundly impacting and incurable. If you are a comedian with Tourette syndrome, and I've talked to many of you, that's your story to tell. Typically, it's all done in good fun when you make your own Tourette's jokes about your life with it, and that comes with education. So it may be education veiled in a joke, and I'm fine with that. That could be a legitimate way to communicate to an audience what Tourette syndrome is like, with a bit of fun too. But yeah, ear of the beholder. It depends on who you are, but as a policy, if you don't have Tourette and you want to make it big as a comedian, you should write some original material, especially the kind that doesn't make light of a battle you've never spent a day with. Do I laugh about my own Tourette? I do when I feel like it. Here's another question that's come in more than once. Has your perspective on Tourette shifted since the start of the podcast? Yes, for sure. My sense of framework, like how big the Tourette community actually is, people all over the world, how to explain Tourette, all the different ways the community has to explain itself, like the one I've adopted about, trying not to blink. Like what's a tick like? Well, it's like, try not to blink. Eventually, you're just going to have to do it. Like that's how I've gotten to explain what my tics were like to people who are unfamiliar. And that's still not exactly what ticking is like. Some say it's kind of like a sneeze. It's still a bit different than that. And I don't know what the perfect analogy is, but I found the blinking analogy seems to convey with people, and that's important. I know more about the science behind Tourette syndrome than I used to. If you'll go back and listen to the episodes we did, like the one I mentioned earlier with Dr. Konalia. Of course, the Tourette Association has free webinars you can see on YouTube covering different expert angles on Tourette. I've made lifelong friends I wouldn't have otherwise via this podcast. And I know I'm getting away from the question a little bit. The question was, has my perspective shifted since starting the podcast? And yeah, the big one is the sense of empathy that someone like Tourette can create within people. And I would go so far as to say, whether they have Tourette or not, people can learn empathy from Tourette syndrome, from absorbing it and what living with it is like. Not overnight. And it's still a work in progress for me. The more I learn, the more I realize I don't know as it goes. But my perspective continues to shift. I've also gone back, as I do sometimes, and listened to old episodes of Tourette's podcast where I'll hear something that I say and I'm like, why did I say that? Or I could have said that so much differently, or maybe I don't even think it anymore. And that's the risk of being on the fly like we are with unscripted conversations. We just talk. So there's that too. I think that answers the question. I hope it does. I'll think more about it. One thing where my perspective hasn't really shifted, this question from the audience, kind of a classic. If science came up with a cure for Tourette syndrome, would you take it? And my answer at this point continues to be no. Depression, yeah, I've had enough of that. I'll take a cure for that. I don't want depression anymore, but not Tourette. It's okay. Again, because I feel like it gives me things like my sense of expression and creativity, my way of language. I think the way I regard myself. It's not all good, but I'm happy with who I am right now. Photography is a job, but it's also my escape, and it's a great escape. And it's an escape from what? From my Tourette, if I'm ticking a lot, from depression, depending on the day. It just occupies my brain and satisfies me. And I think Tourette has connected me with it in a way that I might not otherwise have. It's the love of my life, making photos, going on long walks by myself, bringing my camera, and photographing whatever I see. And I do this in the context of mental health as an activity. Plus, I get the physical, benefit of walking. Anyway, starting to kind of digress, but yeah, a classic question at this point. Would you take the cure pill to eliminate your Tourette? Me? No, I wouldn't. But no judgment to anybody in the community who would. That's your call. And that's what it's all about. To be able to reach the reasonable quality of life that we want, that you want. So medication, no medication, going to the doctor, dealing with it yourself. I don't judge you if you like the direction you're going in. And if you don't like the direction you're going in, hopefully this podcast gives you some comfort, some ideas and support so things get better. And this definitely goes for parents and friends of people with Tourette syndrome as well. We'll keep taking questions, but I think that might do it for episode 0 of season 8. But like I said, keep those questions coming in and I will answer them the best I can by myself, if appropriate, or with the help of experts or the greater Tourette community. If you want to be on the show asking the question you have, and this is what I prefer, record a voice memo into your smartphone of yourself asking the question, and then email that to me, tourettespodcast@gmail.com. And I can take that audio recording and drop it into the show and then do an answer. I love hearing your actual voices, but no pressure if you just want to email me a question to read. Again, tourettespodcast@gmail.com or the contact form at tourettespodcast.com. I'm going to let you get to episode 1 of the new season with amazing guests, Brittany and Aya. You definitely know the Brittany I'm talking about. That's Brittany Wolf, a hero of mine in the Tourette community. You can find that episode at tourettespodcast.com, but if you're subscribed on iTunes or whatever you have, then you should already have it waiting for you. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you again. This is Ben Brown.